I've been replaying Sonic Adventure 1 and I've been having a complete blast with my community on this game. It truly is one of my favourite 3D Sonic games, and today I wanted to make a video going over the boss fights, which I think are an underrated feature on this game. Now for the rules. For this video, I won't be including any of the rival battles, because whilst they are pretty good for comic relief, they're not very good fights, and all of them would be at the bottom of the list. Essentially, if the boss has a health bar, it's going to be on this list. With that being said, we have 21 fights to rank, so if you're interested in more Sonic content, feel free to hit the subscribe button, like the video, all that good stuff, and let's get into the video. It should come as no surprise to anyone who has played Sonic Adventure 1 that the worst boss in the game is Big's one and only boss. There's really not too much to say about this fight. You can win it in under 10 seconds almost every time. Chaos himself poses almost no threat to you whatsoever unless you fuck around deliberately taking too long. And in terms of plot significance, this fight almost has zero. It truly is an embarrassment, and for the worst campaign in the game, it makes sense that it would have the worst fight. It's such a shame having a boss from Sonic and Tails' campaign this low on the list, because they are my favourite campaigns in the game. But the egg carrier is just such a boring encounter. All you do is just avoid the extremely slow projectiles, hit the core, dodge the laser, rinse and repeat. It's not very fun, the music isn't even that remarkable, it's catchy, but nothing special. The fight just exists, unfortunately, and again, you have to do it twice. I'm just gonna speedrun these bosses like the average gamer I am. The first 3 bosses in Gamma's campaign sucks. Beta is so easy, he barely poses any threat to you at all, he stays still for most of the fight, and dies in 3 hits. E104 is a better encounter purely because he has way more health and it's a slightly more interesting, scenario to fight him in. But the fight is still a joke. The lock-on missiles are so easy to deal with, there's really nothing to talk about here. E103 is my favourite of these fairly similar lackluster fights, purely because I think it has the best environment to fight it in, and also the boss is blue, one of my favourite colours. Other than that though, there's not much that can redeem this very lackluster fight, and it's very good that Gamma's later boss fights became much better. He was a slow start when it comes to boss fights, it seems. Chaos Zero is literally the first bit of gameplay you have in Sonic Adventure. You will fight him before you play the first zone, and as a result, there is a lot of pressure put on this boss to introduce you to the gameplay and really hook you into Sonic Adventure. On that note, I think he does it very well, but the fight itself is still incredibly easy. Sonic, even with no upgrades, is just way too powerful for this guy. Not to mention, whilst he jumps really high in the second phase when he has 1 health left, once you get the light speed attack, you can counter this, ending the fight even sooner than you already would. Chaos Zero was a good start to a fantastic game, but he's still a joke of a fight. Whilst Amy's campaign is nothing remarkable, hell, I think it's the second worst campaign in the game, at the very least her one boss that she has is actually pretty good. I really like the story significance where she essentially is overcoming the threat that has pursued her throughout the entire game in the form of a boss fight that she has to confront him. I think that's quite a nice touch, and the fight itself is actually pretty good. Amy can't damage Zero directly, instead that she has to wait for an opening and then hit the big lug of steel into the electrical field to expose his weak spot. I think the fight is actually really good. The problem is Amy herself. She's just not very fun to control. If you could play as, say, Sonic or Knuckles, this fight would easily be in my top 10. Unfortunately, the fight is great on paper, but Amy herself just brings it down way below its potential. The Egg Hornet is a really fun boss fight and a very energetic encounter against the Mad Doctor when you're playing as Sonic. Unfortunately, when you're playing as Tails, you realise that Tails just wasn't designed for this game's boss fights. Essentially, he's just way too overpowered. None of the Mad Doctor's attacks will hit you as long as you're airborne. And unfortunately, when it comes to your turn to attack Eggman, Tails is just not as fun to use as Sonic. Sonic has 4 different ways of attacking when you fully upgrade him. Tails barely has a fraction of that, and his attacks are just a bit clunky by comparison. A really fun fight that I do enjoy, but I just prefer the Sonic version. I don't want to repeat myself too much, so I'll just carry on from what I said before. Tails is way too overpowered against Chaos 4. For one, even if you fall in the water, it's not a death sentence, meaning that Tails can just dodge every one of his attacks. Literally none of them pose a threat to you other than, the swipe laser attack. That's literally it, and once again, unfortunately, Tails just isn't as fun to attack Chaos as, say, Sonic or Knuckles. With Knuckles, you can glide into him from a distance, and from Sonic, well, the world's your oyster. The homing attack is just such a good alternative to anything that Tails is using. E105 is one of the most memorable bosses in Gamma's campaign because of how different it is. For one, the boss doesn't move at all. The difficulty is that the arena itself moves, and you have to deal with the many projectiles whilst finding windows to hit the boss's weak spots. Also, you only have 30 seconds to destroy this boss before time runs out and you have to restart. A very energetic, frantic encounter, and a startling contrast from the fodder that was his first 3 fights. I prefer Knuckles' encounter against Chaos 4 over Tails' because the gliding is not as overpowered and you have more ways to actually go on the offensive and deal damage to the boss. Other than that though, it's pretty much the same fight over again. Sonic's encounter against the Tree Sentinel is my favourite because his spin dash is actually really useful. Not to mention the homing attack is my favourite way of dealing damage to this boss and keeping the pace up. The lily pads work really well for Sonic as he can't just cheese the boss by flying over the boss's head and, you know, being safe from all of the attacks. You actually do need to keep an eye on the boss. It's still not remotely difficult, but it's the most memorable and my favourite of the 3 encounters against Chaos 4. Man, this is such a cool boss against Eggman. The fight with the Egg Hornet when you're playing as Sonic is actually really fun. Don't get me wrong, Sonic's incredibly fast as you would expect, and he can run laps around the Mad Doctor, but at the very least the missiles do pose a threat to you and you can't just fly away as you would with Tails. Not to mention Sonic has multiple ways of attacking Eggman, you know, with the homing attack once again being my favourite way of dealing damage to the bosses. Seriously, it's just kinda crazy how one interesting ability just makes the fight so much better. It's been a while since we've seen you, Chaos 6, and thankfully we've got an actual good fight on our hands here. Knuckles' encounter against this boss is really fun, purely because the arena is actually partially destroyed, meaning you get to utilise his gliding abilities to great effect. As with the Sonic encounter, you have to freeze the boss in order to deal damage with him, and thankfully, just like with Sonic, you have the maximum Knuckles attack to basically two-shot the fight. It really just comes down to which fight you prefer, and simply put, I just prefer the Sonic version of this fight. You have the entire arena to work with, which once again complements Sonic's abilities. Seriously, the level design is really good for these fights. You once again have to freeze Chaos and, you know, to damage him. However, as Knuckles has the maximum heat Knuckles attack, Sonic has the light speed attack, which can vanquish this fight in literally 2 hits if you know what you're doing. This fight is really fun and a very good encounter for Sonic. I don't think it's a coincidence that every boss in my top 5 is a boss that you only fight once as one character, as the reusing of the bosses in this game just really deflated their significance within the story. Chaos 2 is actually a boss that I didn't expect to be as fun as it is. For one, you play as Knuckles and is very combat orientated. Chaos will deflect any attack you throw his way if you try to take him on head on. Instead, you have to wait for the right opportunity in order to land an attack. In other words, you have to wait for him to attack and then you counter, which is a really fun dynamic. He also poses a genuine threat to Knuckles, as even his glide isn't safe due to his arena-wide spanning attack where he turns into a giant puddle across the entire arena. It's a really fun encounter, and I really enjoyed it. The final battle against Beta in the finale of Gamma's campaign is the perfect conclusion, as you're essentially taking on your brother-in-arms that has been disassembled and put back together even stronger by Eggman to finish Gamma finally. This fight is very good and the best fight in his campaign because once again, you can't just spam attacks at him and win that way. Just like with Chaos 2, you have to wait for him to launch a specific attack in order for you to counter. Not to mention he genuinely poses a threat to you with missiles that you have to lock on to destroy them all at once, as well as the fact that he can fly away and spam very dangerous missiles at you to keep you on your toes. This fight is very impressive and it's such a brilliant end to a fairly average campaign. The final battle of Tails' campaign puts you against the Egg Walker, one of my favourite fights in the entire game because of how fun it is, and not to mention the story significance it has, where Tails has no one to hide behind and he has to take it upon himself to vanquish Eggman that way. And the fight is really good because it actually manages to balance Tails' very powerful abilities against a genuine fun fight. Make no mistake, his flight is just as overpowered overpowered as with his other boss fights, but at the very least you can't fly over every one of the Egg Walker's attacks, and you actually have to wait for him to launch attacks in order for you to damage the legs in order to reach the cockpit to deal damage to the boss. It's a really fun fight and a very fun end to Tails' campaign. The 3D debut of Super Sonic is incredible as it puts you against Perfect Chaos, who by this time has taken the form of a giant kaiju-esque monster, and the fight against him is incredible as you race across the flooded city of, Station Square, building up enough speed to literally race through Perfect Chaos's body up and to damage his brain. It's a phenomenal boss, and Open Your Heart, the music that plays during it, is incredible. This begs the question, why is it not at number 1? Two things. One, you have to beat literally every campaign in the game to access this fight, including Big and Amy's, which I just don't think is very reasonable to do. Not to mention, the second phase, the magic is lost a little bit in the second phase, mainly because the music swaps from Open Your Heart to the very ominous music that you are currently listening to, and whilst it's still a fantastic track, it doesn't have the same magic as, Open Your Heart does. It's a very fun fight regardless. I just wish that they kept Open Your Heart throughout the entire fight and gave him new attacks in the second phase. The best Eggman fight in the game, as well as the best boss fight in all of Sonic Adventure, in my opinion, has to be the Egg Viper. And honestly, what a riot. Eggman just pulls out every trick in the book to defeat Sonic with this monstrous machine. Whether it's firing fiery lasers, to laser blasts, to machine guns, to missiles, to literally sending the discs on the side of the machine towards Sonic to impale him. This fight is incredible. The music is once again fantastic, and what makes this even better is the escalation. Eggman tries different tricks every time you damage him. The way that you damage him is different the more, the further the fight goes on, and the Eggman also begins to destroy the platforms, which also adds tension to the fight as it's constantly building into the grandiose finale where Eggman literally, out of a last-ditch effort, literally kamikazes his machine into the boss arena in order to try take down Sonic. It's a phenomenal spectacle. I love everything about this fight, and it is one of my favorite. It is the best boss fight in all of Sonic Adventure for me.